Welcome to our deep dive into John Locke. This one's going to be interesting. We've got some excerpts from a Spanish language book all about Locke's life and philosophy and the setting, 17th century England.
Ah, yes, 17th century England. It was a time of massive upheaval. You had political and religious tensions all over, and science was making all these new discoveries that really shook things up. It's amazing Locke was able to get any thinking done with all that going on.
Right. But the book highlights that chaos, and it actually helps us understand how Locke developed his ideas,
Yeah?
especially the ones that were seen as radical at the time. Like individual liberty, separation of church and state, and even the right to rebel against a tyrannical government.
Absolutely. Locke wasn't just theorizing from some quiet corner. He was living through it all. A civil war, political plots, religious clashes. Imagine trying to make sense of government and human nature in the middle of all that.
It's mind-boggling. So to really get Locke, we have to get 17th century England. What was going on back then?
Well, it was a time of massive transition. You had feudalism giving way to a more market-driven economy. And this rising merchant class was really fueling that change. Then you have the Catholic Church losing its grip, and Protestantism, especially in England, was on the rise.
And of course, the printing press was spreading new ideas faster than ever.
Exactly. It was a period of immense change. And Locke was right there in the thick of it.
Now the book dives into Locke's life, and it's pretty fascinating. He was on the winning side of the English Civil War, which certainly didn't hurt.
It helped him get a good education. Went to Westminster School, then Oxford, even dabbled in medicine.
He even had some government jobs, right?
He did. That practical experience is something a lot of philosophers didn't have. It really shaped his thinking, made him less theoretical and more grounded in the real world.
But then politics got a bit tricky for him.
Oh, yes. He ended up exiled in the Netherlands.
That must have been a tough time.
It was. But it also turned out to be pretty productive. He actually wrote some of his most important works during his exile, including his essay concerning human understanding. That's where he lays out his theory of knowledge. And it was revolutionary stuff.
Okay, so we've got all this chaos and change, and in the middle of it, we've got John Locke forming some truly radical ideas. The book focuses on two main areas: his theory of knowledge, or epistemology, and his political philosophy. And to be honest, even though I've studied Locke before, the way this book explains his theory of knowledge is pretty mind-blowing.
It's because he went straight at one of the biggest thinkers of the time, René Descartes.
Oh yeah, Descartes, the I think therefore I am guy.
That's the one. Descartes was all about rationalism,
Yeah.
the idea that we're born with innate knowledge. But Locke completely disagreed. He was an empiricist. He believed we learn through our experiences, through our senses.
So he's basically saying that our minds are like blank slates when we're born.
Exactly. He even used that metaphor, the tabula rasa, a blank slate. He argued that if we were born with innate knowledge, wouldn't everyone think the same way regardless of where they were born or how they were raised?
Yeah, good point. We don't see that in the real world. People think differently all over the place.
Exactly. It's our experiences that shape us.
Yeah.
So how do those experiences turn into knowledge? That's where Locke gets really interesting. He breaks it down into two sources: sensation and reflection.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for me.
Sensation is all about what we perceive with our senses. The taste of food, the feel of the wind, the sound of music. It's direct input from the world around us.
Makes sense. So what about reflection?
That's the internal stuff.
Yeah.
It's how we process those sensations, our thinking, our doubts, our beliefs. It all happens in our minds.
So it's this constant back and forth between the world hitting our senses and our minds trying to make sense of it all.
Exactly. And from all that, Locke says we form ideas. And he divides them into two types, simple and complex.
Ah, more categories. All right, hit me with it. What are simple ideas?
Simple ideas are like the basic building blocks of knowledge. Think of the coldness of ice, the sweetness of sugar, the redness of an apple. These are direct perceptions that can't be broken down further.
Got it. So the simple stuff, and then we build on that.
We do. We use our minds to combine abstract. And from those simple ideas, we build complex ideas.
So like the idea of a tree would be a complex idea.
Precisely. You're combining simple ideas like trunk, branches, leaves to form that complex idea.
It's amazing how our minds do that, taking these simple bits of information and building whole worlds of understanding.
And Locke was fascinated by that process. But he also understood that our knowledge isn't perfect. There are limitations. And that's where his distinction between primary and secondary qualities comes in.
Okay, this is getting a little deep for me. What are primary and secondary qualities?
Think about that apple again. It has certain qualities that are inherent to it, like its size and shape. Those are primary qualities. They exist in the apple itself, no matter who's looking at it. But then there are qualities like color, taste, smell.
Ah, okay. So the apple might look red to me, but a dog might see it differently.
Exactly. Those are secondary qualities.
Mm.
They depend on our perception, on how our senses interact with the object.
So even something as basic as color isn't really in the object itself. It's created by our minds.
That's what Locke argued. It's a pretty radical idea when you think about it.
Yeah.
Our reality is to some extent constructed by our own minds.
Whoa, that's trippy. But it also makes sense. And I can see how these ideas about knowledge and perception would influence Locke's political philosophy. If our senses can deceive us, how do we know what's true about the world? How do we build a just and stable government?
You're hitting on a key point. Locke's ideas about knowledge and perception are deeply connected to his political thinking. And that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
This is fascinating stuff. I can't wait to hear more.
Welcome back to our deep dive into John Locke. Now that we've gotten a handle on his theory of knowledge, let's jump into his political philosophy.
I'm ready for it. And from what I've read, it's just as groundbreaking as his ideas about knowledge.
It absolutely is. And just like his theory of knowledge, his political ideas were shaped by the crazy times he lived through. Remember, he witnessed a civil war, a king overthrown, a republic rise and fall, and all this while people were fighting over religious freedom.
It's amazing he had time to think straight with all that going on.
Right. But that chaos really pushed him to grapple with some big questions.
Yeah.
How do you build a just and stable society? What limits should there be on government? What rights do individuals have that no one can take away? He was dealing with real-world problems that needed real-world solutions.
And one of his big solutions was the social contract, right? The book spends a lot of time on that idea.
It was a huge concept at the time. And Locke's version of it was super influential. It all starts with his idea of the state of nature.
Ah, the state of nature. That hypothetical scenario where there's no government, no laws, no one in charge. It's kind of a scary thought. Everyone just fending for themselves.
It can be a bleak picture. And for another big thinker of the time, Thomas Hobbes, it was terrifying. He described it as a war of all against all, where life would be nasty, brutish, and short.
Yikes. But Locke didn't see it that way, right? He was a bit more optimistic.
He was. He had a more nuanced view. He believed that even without a government, there's a natural law that governs how we behave. A law of reason that says we all have inherent rights. Rights given by God, not by any ruler.
So even in this state of nature, where it's a free-for-all, there's still a sense of right and wrong.
That's what Locke believed. And those inherent rights for him were life, liberty, and property. He argued that those rights don't come from the government. They exist before any political structure.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. So if we have these rights, even without a government, why would we bother creating one in the first place? That seems like more trouble than it's worth.
That's where the social contract comes in. Locke said that while the state of nature might offer freedom, it doesn't offer much security or stability. You don't have anyone to settle disputes fairly or protect you from people who want to violate your rights. So we choose to create a government. We give up some of our absolute freedom in exchange for the protection of our rights and a stable society.
It's like a trade-off. We give up a little autonomy to get the benefits of a structured society, but doesn't that give the government a ton of power?
It does. But here's the catch. For Locke, the government's power has limits. It can't just trample all over those natural rights that it was created to protect. In fact, if the government becomes tyrannical, if it starts taking away our rights, Locke says the people have a right to rebel.
Oh, hold on. He's talking about revolution, isn't he? That's a pretty radical idea, especially back then.
It is, and this idea had a huge impact on later revolutions, like the American Revolution. Locke was saying that ultimately power comes from the people. The government gets its legitimacy from the consent of the governed. If it breaks that contract, the people have the right to get rid of it.
It's incredible how these ideas from centuries ago are still so relevant today. But Locke's political philosophy goes beyond just the right to rebel, right? The book talks about his ideas on limited government and the separation of powers, too.
Yes, he was a big advocate for both of those. He believed that government power should be limited and that power should be divided among different branches. We know this today as the separation of powers. The idea is to prevent any one person or group from getting too much power and becoming a dictator.
Like checks and balances. That's a core principle of a lot of modern democracies. But even with those safeguards, wasn't Locke worried about the government overstepping its boundaries, especially when it came to personal beliefs and conscience?
Absolutely. And that's where his views on religious tolerance and the separation of church and state come in.
I think this is one of the most fascinating parts of Locke's thinking, especially considering he was a devout Christian himself.
It is interesting, isn't it? But for Locke, religious belief was about individual conscience. He was totally against using force to make people believe something. He said you can't force true faith, and that trying to do so just creates hypocrisy and social unrest.
So freedom of conscience was super important to him. But how did he think that freedom should work in relation to the government?
He believed in a clear separation of church and state. He said the government's job is to protect individual rights and keep society running smoothly, not to enforce religious beliefs. People should be free to worship as they choose, as long as they're not harming others or disturbing the peace.
It's amazing how far ahead of his time he was on this.
He was truly groundbreaking. Of course, we have to acknowledge that even Locke had his blind spots. He didn't always apply this principle of tolerance consistently. His views on atheists and Catholics weren't exactly tolerant, but his arguments for religious freedom were still a huge step forward and have had a lasting impact on how we think about democracy.
Okay, so we've covered the social contract, the right to rebel, limited government, religious tolerance. Locke's political philosophy is all about protecting individual rights. But there's one more piece we haven't talked about yet, property.
Yes, property. This is where things get a bit more complicated and even controversial.
The book mentions his labor theory of property. What's that all about?
Locke believed that the right to property is a fundamental natural right, just like life and liberty. He said that you gain ownership of something by mixing your labor with it.
So if I plant a field of corn or build a house, it becomes mine because I put work into it.
That's the basic idea. It's called the labor theory of property, and it had a huge influence on the development of capitalism.
Yeah.
Of course, there are some problems with this theory, as people have pointed out.
I can see how that could be problematic. Like, what about the rights of indigenous people who might have a different understanding of land ownership, or the way workers are exploited under capitalism?
You're right. Those are complex issues that Locke's theory doesn't fully address. It's important to remember that he was writing in a very different time.
Right. We can't judge him by today's standards. But it's still interesting to think about how his ideas play out in the modern world, both the good and the bad.
Absolutely. Locke's work is full of these kinds of complexities, and that's what makes it so interesting. So we've talked about his theory of knowledge and his radical political philosophy, but this book also looks at his ideas on education, which is a bit unexpected for a political theorist.
It is a bit surprising, but for Locke, education was essential for creating a good society. He thought education builds character, teaches people to be virtuous, and prepares them to be responsible citizens.
Exactly. It wasn't just about learning facts and figures. It was about developing the whole person. In his book, Some Thoughts Concerning Education, he talked about how important it is to nurture a child's natural curiosity, encourage learning through experience and play, and avoid harsh punishments.
That sounds way ahead of his time. Weren't kids getting beaten in schools back then?
It was pretty common. So Locke was definitely progressive on that front. Of course, he was mainly focused on educating gentlemen, which reflects the class system of his time. But his ideas about child development and the importance of a well-rounded education are still relevant today.
Makes you wonder what he'd think of our schools now.
It's a good question. Maybe he'd approve of some things and be critical of others, but I bet he'd still be passionate about education and its power to shape individuals and society.
It's a good reminder that education isn't just about filling our heads with knowledge. It's about becoming better people and building a better world. It really makes you think, how would Locke view our schools today? Would he think we've lost sight of those core principles?
It's hard to say, but it is interesting to consider how much emphasis we put on testing and standardized learning. Maybe we've moved away from that more holistic approach that Locke advocated for.
Yeah, maybe. We get so focused on measuring things that we forget about developing those less tangible qualities, like character and critical thinking. But speaking of lifelong learners, Locke himself was a pretty good example. He wasn't just a philosopher. He was a doctor, a political advisor, a government official.
He was definitely a man of action. He didn't just sit around thinking about the world. He got out there and experienced it, applied his intellect to real-world problems.
Exactly. And that's what makes his philosophy so compelling. It's grounded in experience, not just abstract ideas.
It's a good reminder that philosophy isn't just some ivory tower pursuit. It's about engaging with the world, wrestling with tough questions, constantly seeking understanding.
And Locke was fearless in that pursuit. He wasn't afraid to challenge authority, even his own. I mean, he was a devout Christian, but he championed ideas that were considered pretty radical by many people at the time.
He was a true independent thinker. He followed the path of reason wherever it led, even if it meant questioning his own beliefs.
And that's a powerful legacy. He showed us the importance of thinking for ourselves, of not blindly accepting what we're told.
That's the foundation of a free society. We need citizens who can think critically and challenge assumptions, not just follow the crowd.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into John Locke, it makes you wonder, what would he think about our world today? What would he say about our political climate, our technological advancements, our globalized society?
It's impossible to know for sure, but one thing's certain. His core principles are as relevant today as they were in his time. The importance of individual rights, limited government, the rule of law, and the constant pursuit of knowledge.
Those are values that transcend time and place. They're essential for any society that wants to be free and just.
And as we move forward into this uncertain future, it's up to us to keep those principles alive, to engage in thoughtful debate, to challenge injustice, to never stop learning.
Well said. It's been a fascinating journey exploring the world of John Locke. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, keep those minds engaged.